We begin the day with Russia's wish list for its future dealings with the West. Today, Moscow published a set of security proposals that aim to limit NATO's expansion into former Soviet countries. The documents were handed to the United States early this week. President Putin is demanding legally binding guarantees that NATO would give up any military activity in Eastern Europe and Ukraine.
The line pursued by the United States and NATO over recent years to aggressively escalate the security situation is absolutely unacceptable and extremely dangerous. Washington and its NATO allies should immediately stop hostile actions against our country, including unscheduled war games, dangerous encounters, and manoeuvres of military ships and planes, and stop the military use of Ukrainian territory.
Well, NATO's leadership and the White House have indicated that they are open to talks with Russia, but they insist that every country has the right to determine its own future without outside interference. And the alliance has rejected what it says amounts to a veto on its expansion.
We have received Russia's recent proposals. We are clear that any dialogue with Russia would also need to address NATO's concerns about Russia's actions, be based on the core principles and documents of European security, and take place in consultation with NATO's European partners, such as Ukraine.
Well, tensions between Russia and the West have soared over a recent build-up of Russian troops near Ukraine, triggering fears of an invasion. Moscow denies any plan to attack its neighbour, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. This is some of the latest video from Russia's border region. It was shot by a French television crew about 8 kilometres from Ukraine. According to the reporter, this normally functions as an occasional training area for the Russian army. But for weeks now, they've been massing troops and equipment, essentially turning it into a military base. So let's take a closer look at these Russian demands and NATO's responses with DW correspondent Terry Schultz. Welcome, Terry. Let's start with more about about what Russia has been asking for.
Well, Phil, you know, we've been hearing these complaints from Moscow for years about how NATO should not be expanding to countries that were in the former Soviet sphere of influence. So they didn't really come as a surprise, most of them. At the same time, when you see things written down, when they are delivered in the form of proposed treaties, one between the U.S. and Russia and one between NATO and Russia, it takes on a different flavor. And I think it was pretty bold of President Putin to write out these supposed treaties and hand them over now in the midst of such tense times.
And was there an or else in this, stated or implied?
I think there are tens of thousands of or-elses massed along the border with Ukraine. Russia, again, as I mentioned, it prepared these treaties for the first time, written down, spelled out in such detail, while it has possibly more than 100,000 soldiers massing along multiple points on the border with Ukraine. And I heard even as recently as today from a NATO diplomat that despite the phone call between Presidents Biden and Putin, despite all the talk about wanting to de-escalate, that Russia is instead escalating, that it is moving more and more material, troops, and long-term facilities into this region, keeping NATO and the U.S. very nervous.
Right, so on the face of it, though, amongst these demands, like demanding a veto on NATO members and telling NATO where it can and can't deploy its forces, these sound like demands that Moscow expects to fail or to be rejected. So can we speculate about what President Putin really wants?
Well, some of them are not ones that Russia expects to fail. Some of them, of course, are. I mean, one of the most, I think, outrageous ones is that it says that NATO cannot deploy any sort of resources in countries that are NATO members, like the Baltic states, any country that joined after 1997, which they did. So, I mean, some of those obviously are non-starters. Others are actually things that NATO would like to see, that the U.S. would like to see, limitations on on what kind of missiles can be based where and used, and especially, as you heard Secretary General Stoltenberg say, confidence-building measures. Now, this is something that NATO has been asking from Russia for years, about more transparency, about what kind of exercises that it's launching in countries near the border of NATO allies, in Belarus, for example. And Russia has been simply unresponsive to these requests from NATO. So sure, some of them, if Russia were to undertake them with any genuine interest, would be something NATO would be interested in discussing. But that remains to be seen. As I say, Russia has refused to, for example, allow observers to its exercises, as it is required to do under international agreements. So there actually could be some things to talk about that would be good for both sides.
And how have NATO representatives been responding to these demands?
You heard the Secretary General say, as I just mentioned, that there are things that NATO would like to talk about. At the same time, there are issues such as giving Moscow a veto over which countries can join NATO that will never, ever be something that can even be put on the table in any way, shape, or form. Russia will not have the right to say that Ukraine can't become a NATO member, or certainly that any sort of deployments must be pulled out of NATO allies. But written into these proposed treaties are also some measures that could be discussed, but I just reread them before we were coming on the air, and some of them even already exist. For example, that hotlines would be set up between NATO and Russia in case to avoid any sort of mistakes or incidents. That already exists, so some of these are kind of puzzling to me.
Meanwhile, Russia, of course, is massing its own troops on its own territory, menacingly close to Ukraine, which isn't a NATO member. So has NATO said what these massive consequences will be, or this high price that Russia will pay if Russia does, in fact, invade Ukraine?
Trust me, Phil, we ask constantly what exactly they would do. And of course, they will not divulge what they are preparing for in case Russia were to invade Ukraine. I mean, it is said constantly that because Ukraine is not a NATO member, there's no Article 5 guarantee for that country. It cannot call the NATO allies to defend it in case of further aggression, in case of an invasion by Russia. And Ukraine is very painfully aware of this. At the same time, if Russia were to step across the border to do more than it's already done in taking Crimea, Ukraine's Crimea region, the West could not fail to respond. That would simply be too great of an aggression against a partner country of NATO allies, of the United States. So I think that one important point is that, for example, last night the European Union and NATO put out statements talking about repercussions for Moscow. The European Union could take very extreme financial measures that could cut off, for example, Russian banks. That would be the most instant response that could be done by the international community, and perhaps the one that Russia would feel the most keenly. NATO is unlikely to mount a military response to a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Nonetheless, most of the allies are also members of the European Union, plus the United States, and they have ways of making Moscow feel pain if it were to take this step and truly go back into Ukraine.
All right, we shall watch and wait. For now, Terry, thank you so much. Terry Schultz in Brussels.